Hey everyone, the focus of this lecture is to talk about some of the themes of Paul's letters. Um, we've talked about Paul when we looked at the book of Acts, and we looked at some of the main themes that he had there. And I just want to show you how they kind of work themselves out here in the letter of Romans. So, Paul is actually writing to the Roman church to ask them to support the Jewish church in Jerusalem, Jewish Christians who are suffering a famine and so on. And so he's trying to raise money, and that's why I titled it Romans, Paul the fundraiser. He's going to this Roman church to ask them to support their brothers and sisters living in Jerusalem. But there's been some things that are happening in the Roman Empire. The Jews have many of them been kicked out of Rome, and there's an emperor that isn't happy with the Jewish people. And so he's probably primarily writing to a group of Gentiles, although there are probably some Jewish Christians that are left in the church. And what he wants to do is he wants to focus on the question, has God kept God's promise? Because the promise that God made to Abraham was that God would bless the world through through Israel, through the Jewish people, but many of the Jews haven't accepted Jesus Christ, and so it's a question of the righteousness of God. Has God kept His promise? And so that's a big part of what this letter is about. And so you hear the kind of focus of the letter right here in verse 16 of chapter 1. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. So he starts out by talking about faith and is going to want to talk about Abraham, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. But what he does is he begins in chapters 1 and 2 by trying to show that the Gentiles and Jews are in the same situation. So he starts by talking about the Gentiles and all the evil things that they were doing before they came to faith in Jesus Christ. This is who you once were. And then there's a sense in which you could almost imagine some of the Jewish Christians or saying, oh yeah, look at those silly Gentiles, they're doing all these things. But then he goes on in chapter 2 to focus on the Jews and the Jewish perspective, that they think because they have the law and because of circumcision and things like that somehow they're better. But what he's saying is they're in the same situation. And so if you remember what we talked about with Paul and his emphasis on justification by faith, he wasn't saying that the law was bad, but he was arguing that because of exile, because of sin, the law brings judgment and it now doesn't save. So they're in the same situation. And so then he moves into chapter 3 and begins talking about how God is at work creating a new people, and he focuses on Abraham and wants to, in chapter 4, kind of move to the person of Abraham and to the fact that it's because Abraham believed God, and so Abraham, by faith, receives righteousness. And so the whole notion of justification by faith is focused on here, that God is creating a new people out of the Jew and Gentile grouping, and that this is the promise and the blessing that has come through Abraham. And so you would see, if you went back and read that part of the book, that Abraham is a primary focus of the text, and that there's an old Adam and a new Adam. Jesus is the new Adam. You would read in this section in chapter 6, so that Christ's death becomes our death, and Christ's resurrection becomes our resurrection. And it's framed in the context of exile and restoration, as we've been talking about. That he's framing sin in the terms of exile and restoration to say that now in Jesus Christ, both Jew and Gentile are being reconciled by faith in Christ, by being united to him. And then you get these chapters 9 through 11 that are controversial, and a lot of people want to use them to talk about some abstract doctrine of election, but that isn't what Paul is trying to do. What he's trying to say is, like, you Gentiles have benefited from the Jewish story, that when you read the text and it talks about God's sovereignty and God's choice, and he's saying that, okay, if just because Jewish people haven't believed now, their unbelief has led to your inclusion is a big part of the argument that he's making. And this is the fulfillment of the promise and the blessing. And he even seems to hint that God isn't done with Israel yet. But the main point seems to be that you Gentiles have benefited from the Jewish story. Now you can see what he's doing. He's setting this up to say, all right, now you need to support the church. You need to support the Jewish Christians who are struggling in Jerusalem. Romans 12 through 14, he's kind of saying, all right, now this is what it means to be the new community. So one way to think about it is read Romans 1 and 2 is saying, all right, this is who you once were. And then the Romans 3 through 11, this is what God has done. And now 12 through 14 is saying, this is now who you are. This is what it means to live as the new community, to be a people of love. And if you read through chapter 12, you would see, he starts by saying, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. Do not be conformed to this world. So in other words, to the patterns of this age. We're no longer live by the patterns of this age, but we've been transformed. And then he talks about love and loving one another, living in harmony. And there's this whole sense in chapters 12 and 13 to kind of say, all right, now this is how we live. This is what it means to be the new community. And then we get into chapters 15 and 16. He's kind of here honing in on his argument that they're going to be filled with goodness and that these churches are going to benefit from their generosity and so on. And he's been going around collecting money and ministry for the saints in chapter 15 and is saying, look, we need to help them out and you need to help them out. And because God has been gracious and you've been grafted in, please, let's benefit the community. So I put it kind of crassly there. But and then he kind of says, I'm coming, so you better give me some money. It's one of those things like, hey, I know you're going to do this. I know you'll do the right thing. And by the way, I'm coming to visit. And so he's preparing them for his visit so he can gather resources to bring back to the church in Jerusalem. But what the importance of this letter for us is really this idea of justification by faith. That Jew and Gentile, now we're all saved by faith in Jesus Christ, because in his death and resurrection, the exile has been overcome and we all now share in the blessing. First and Second Corinthians are letters that are kind of dealing with a church that is divided. There are divisions. There are churches that are Christians in this church that are seeing themselves as more spiritual than other people. So the Corinthian people were obsessed with status and honor and kind of finding their place there. And so Paul is writing to a church that is really divided. And, we don't have the other side of the letter. What are the actual things? What were they asking, or what did the first letter say? But what he's doing is he's talking here about leadership and spirituality. What does it mean to be spiritual? And so you get a real emphasis on weakness here in Corinthians. Because what he's saying is that in Christ, again, we're not to set ourselves to the patterns of this age, but now we are living by a different kingdom, one that focuses on love. And he talks about foolishness, that the gospel is foolishness. And what he's trying to do is weaken the cultural categories by which these Corinthian Christians are trying to divide themselves. And then he addresses some specific issues. There are some weird sexual things going on in the community that he is specifically kind of focused against, these divisions that we've been talking about. But he's also focused on proper worship. So there's a whole section in chapter 11 where he's kind of saying, look, you're doing the Lord's Supper wrong. Now, what was happening was the rich Christians were showing up and starting without the Christians who were poor and maybe were servants and had to work. And so he's saying that this is not the way this goes. So we are a community, we are a new people. So wait for one another, and to celebrate the Lord's Supper, this communion together, is to love one another and recognize the community. So the love chapter comes in this chapter, or in this book. And the reason it comes in this book is Paul is saying that, I can speak in the tongue of men and angels. I can have all the prophetic, all these high spiritual things. But if I don't love my brother and sister, I'm nothing. So love becomes the dominant or the prominent act of spirituality. Is we love one another, and we wait for one another, and we look out for one another. And this is a mark of what it means to be the church. You can also see, if you would read through it, that he's concerned about the proper order. And so you've got some specific things that are happening in the Corinthian church. Galatians, again, is about justification by faith. And so we talked about justification by faith when we talked about the book of Acts. And Paul is writing to these churches in Galatia. And there's a conflict there. You have these Jewish Christians who are kind of saying that the Gentile Christians still need to adhere to the law. They need to be circumcised. And as we talked before, there's a sense in which, for the Jewish Christians to participate in the law and do those types of things is still fine. But what Paul was saying is that we're now saved by faith in Christ. And so Gentiles are not required to necessarily adhere to these things with the law. And so the primary question here is, do Gentiles have to become Jews first before they become Christians? And Paul is saying no. And he writes this letter. He's very frustrated because they know better, is what he's really trying to say. They know that now we are saved by grace and through faith in Jesus Christ. And so he goes on to talk a lot about the function of the law. And he talks about how the cultural categories are weakened. So Galatians 3:27 through 4:7, he's saying in Christ there is no longer male or female, Jew or Greek, slave or free. These are the dominant cultural categories, and he's saying these things have been relativized now in Jesus Christ. So we are now part of a new community of people, and he wants to emphasize then Christian freedom. So 1 Thessalonians, we talked about this a little while back, where there are some people who are worried about the second coming, and Paul is writing to them to encourage them. So this is probably one of the first letters that Paul wrote, one of the earliest letters that he wrote. And so he is encouraging them. They're anxious. Some of the people are dying, and they were waiting for Christ to return, and so they're wondering, what happens now to the dead if Christ doesn't come back? And he's saying the dead are not lost. He talks about the coming of the Lord, as we've talked about. And then he encourages them to live a life of love. Now, there are also these letters that are called kind of the disputed letters of Paul. And what this means is that if you do some biblical scholarship, you would see that there are people who question whether or not Paul wrote these letters. Ephesians, Colossians, and the pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Now, for our purposes, I think we can confidently say they are connected with Paul in some way. And so what we're getting here is Paul's thought and Paul's ideas. And so in Ephesians and Colossians, you get kind of the same themes, the breaking down the wall between Jew and Gentile, especially in Ephesians. And then he goes on in both of the letters to use the household codes of the ancient world. If you remember, when we did Epic of Eden, we were talking about the patriarchal, the patrilocal, and so on. And so the ancient world is organized by these kind of household codes. And so he uses them then to talk about what it is to live as the church. And so he will say, wives, submit to your husbands, but husbands, love your wives. But he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So these can be a little bit controversial, where it talks about, is Paul saying that we need to live by this hierarchical, kind of patriarchal world still today? Or was he using kind of the household codes of the ancient world to just simply say, hey, this is how we live together now. We love one another, we serve one another, we have different roles, we look out for one another, and we take care of one another. And then in Ephesians especially, but also in Colossians, you get this sense of the powers that are at work in the world. So Paul in Ephesians kind of talks about putting on the armor of God, but what he's saying is we're fighting against the principalities and powers. Our enemies are no longer flesh and blood. It's no longer the Gentiles. It's no longer, right, the Babylonians or whomever. We're now fighting kind of the principalities and powers at work in this world that go beyond that. Because now Jew and Gentile have been brought together. There's a conversion and a bringing together of the Jew and Gentile. First and Second Timothy and Titus are pastoral letters, so he's put people in place in some of these churches, and he's writing to them to encourage them as they lead these communities. So Timothy in Ephesus, and he's written 2 letters to kind of give him advice on some of the stuff that he's dealing with. Their guidance for leadership. They're dealing with false teachings. There's stuff in Timothy especially where you kind of possibly see a proto-Gnosticism kind of developing. And Titus is a similar letter where he's writing to Titus, who is his kind of representative at this church, and he is giving them advice. So the book of Hebrews is an interesting book. We don't know if it's written by Paul. It probably isn't. We don't know who wrote it, but it's certainly written to Jewish Christians because it has all of this imagery from the Old Testament. So it is written to Jewish Christians, encouraging them and talking to them about faith in Jesus Christ. They're also enduring hardship. And so it's a form of Jewish midrash where it's making kind of an interpretation, moving from lesser to greater. What does that mean? Well, the Levitical priesthood of the Old Testament is the lesser, and now Christ as the great high priest is the greater. And so you get these things God has spoken in the past. So you see the Torah, Levitical priesthood, the Sabbath. But now what it's saying is God has spoken more definitively here in his Son, Jesus Christ. So again, it's written to Jewish Christians who are struggling. And it's kind of unpacking this understanding of Jesus and Christianity through the context of the Old Testament. The book of James is a very interesting book because it really has a Jewish emphasis. And it focuses on works. So where Paul is saying we're not saved by works, or saved by grace through faith, James is saying that faith without works is dead. And so it's kind of connecting them together. Now, the way to understand this is James is kind of this Christian wisdom writing. So if you go back to the book of Proverbs, you would see all this wisdom writing that is kind of instructions on how to live. And so James is a practically focused letter to Jewish Christians, kind of saying that this is kind of how we're supposed to live. That faith is not just belief, intellectual stuff, but faith is a particular way of life. And so you also have moral and ethical concerns here. Specifically, care for the poor. James talks about favoritism, caring for one another. He talks about wholesome speech. And again, the main kind of theme of this is that, look, faith without works is dead. We have to live this out. We believe in Jesus Christ and are transformed by grace through faith, and yet that leads to a new way of life kind of living in the world. And so he wants these Christians to remember that and to reflect upon that. First and Second Peter is writing to the church in Rome, and he's talking about their Christian identity, that they're a new people. And so it's a fascinating letter because he seems to be giving them some advice on how to get along in the Roman Empire. Some of them are maybe being persecuted because they live differently than the people around them. And so he's saying to them that you are an alien people, that you are people on the way, but you are also, as Jeremiah says, and the prophet Jeremiah says, to seek the welfare of the city, that you're to honor the emperor, you're to honor everybody, you're to live your life in a way that is for good and not for evil, so that people can't say bad things about you. But what he's really talking about is how they are a new people now marked by baptism and resurrection. In a sense, they're a new Israel. And that they're suffering, they're sharing in the suffering of Christ. And so really it's focused on how do we live as the new people of God in the world. And then 2 Peter, which is much shorter, kind of talks about some false teachers that they're to be aware of and to not listen to. And then you have the letters of John and Jude, and we'll just summarize this, but which again, in John's gospel, what you find is what does it mean to be the Christian community? The false teachers have come in, there's opposition to the gospel, there's some dissension, And so he again is saying that we ought to love one another. We get this line in here where God is love, and that if we don't love our neighbors, or if we don't bear that mark of love for our neighbors or our fellow Christians, then we're not living into what God calls us, who God calls us to be. And so when you read that letter, you'd see again, it's written to a specific group of people who are wrestling with different things. And so again, the focus is on what does it mean to live as a Christian community. And you again, the second and third letter gets, and the first letter, but they get into talking about antichrists and people opposing them and false teachers and so on. And so John is dealing, the author is dealing with some issues that have arisen in the community. And then you get this letter of Jude, which is also about false teachers. So at this time, there begins to be these different, what they call heresies or false teaching that's kind of creeping in, trying to lead people astray. And you get this fascinating story of the archangel Michael battling Lucifer for Moses' body, which actually comes from a book that is found in the Apocrypha, but it's quoted in the book of Jude. And that's what this picture actually is about. But again, it's about, the focus is about false teachers, and to be aware about teachers that are trying to lead people astray and calling people to remain steadfast to the gospel, to continue to live as the new community in the world. And so all of these letters, it's just important. It's like you sending emails or texts. We only get one side of it. But what happened was these letters would be sent around to different churches, and they would be read, and each church would hear, all right, here's what's going on in some of these other places. But at the same time, Paul and John and Peter are calling the Christian community to live a certain way, to live a life of faith and to hold on to their faith. And what does it mean now to live in the world, to live in the Roman Empire, and to live in Asia Minor when you're dealing with all of these different things. So many of these letters are about encouragement, they're about teaching, and kind of helping them articulate their faith and what it means to be a Christian at this time. So that's a quick summary of these letters. Hopefully it made sense. And then the last book that we'll talk about is the book of Revelation.